This episode is brought to you by the Mediocre Movie Club. Mediocre Movie Club is a self-professed group of idiots who give above average, looking for that satisfactory feel, reviews on movies, documentaries, shows, music, and all other media. You can find the MMC on X by searching for Mediocre Movie CL. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads by searching for Mediocre Movie Club. Of course, you find all the group's reviews and engage with the members on its website, www.mediocremovie.club. That's mediocremovie.club. We're in for another episode of The Outsider, and I have got a special guest for you today. Joining me is someone who's been an advocate in Lubbock for some time, and we're going to get to know and ask some, I think, some good questions to our very good friend, Dr. Nick Bergfeld. Dr. Bergfeld, thank you for joining me on this episode.
Yeah, happy to be here, man. Thanks for the invite.
Right on, right on. I'm happy to have you here and happy to dig into some issues and some conversation. So, let's just start out from the beginning and get into where we are today. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were born and raised in Lubbock, is that right?
Raised, yes, born in a corn farming town in Nebraska, Aurora, Nebraska. My family moved here in 1992. I started first grade at Whiteside Elementary. So the only schooling I missed here would have been kindergarten.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So great. Okay. And where'd you end up going to high school and in what year did you graduate?
Yeah, so did Whiteside, and then the typical feeder school for there is Irons Junior High.
Hmm.
And one of the, I think, the greatest presence of mind or self-awareness that I had at that age, uh, Irons Junior High had a reputation for being the jock junior high of Lubbock at the time. And I already at that point was a sci-fi fantasy loving Dungeons and Dragons nerd. And I knew that my life was just going to be absolutely terrible if I went there. And so I applied for, there was a magnet program at the time to attend OL Slayton across town. So I did that for junior high, met a lot of friends on that side of town and wanted to stick around over there. And so instead of going to Coronado, I then also did the magnet program at Lubbock High. And I graduated from Lubbock High in 2005 and was the valedictorian of my year. So I had no complaints whatsoever educationally. The public school system here in Lubbock, Lubbock Independent School District, I'm a 100% product of it and enormously proud of that fact.
That's wonderful. What a great story that is. So from Lubbock High, and correct me if I'm wrong, you go to Harvard, is that right?
So Texas Tech first. I was a
Texas Tech.
Texas Tech undergrad. Yeah,
Very
yeah,
good.
yeah. I wanted to stick around. I had grown up around Texas Tech and did a lot of the summer camp programs.
Mm.
Shake Hands with Your Future was the name of one, a couple other ones. So I'd always envisioned, there wasn't a point in time where I thought that I was going to go anywhere else. And to be honest, I didn't apply anywhere else. Like I just thought tech was where I was going to go. So I did my undergrad there, two bachelor's degrees, one in biochemistry, one in psychology. I thought I was going to get a PhD in neuroscience was my kind of original career pathway, you could say. I was obsessed with the mind, brain, and behavior, and the intersection of those things, and wanted to explore opportunities as a career for that. Ultimately, decided that PhD researcher wasn't really in the cards for me. And so after undergrad, I went to Yale for medical school, and then after that, Harvard for public policy. So I thought about things at more of a systems level and had really great mentors in medical school that encouraged me to pursue either the philosophy there is called health in all policies. So the belief that health touches any kind of policy, whether that be economic, civil rights, environmental justice, business, all those types of things have angles where you can think about health as a component of that conversation. And it just made sense to me because so much of our lives when it comes to our health is determined by things that aren't necessarily in our control. People call those the social determinants of health. And I remember learning a startling fact in medical school that about 70% or so of hospitalizations in the United States are from preventable illness. And it really just got me thinking, wow, I mean, it really feels like I'm on the bottom end of a really nasty process. And by the point in time that somebody gets to me in the waiting room, in the hospital, so much life has happened to them. So many things have happened to them up until that point where there's not really a whole lot that I can do. Surgeons, yes, but chronic disease, non-communicable chronic disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, high blood pressure, were all things that were more of a product of the environments that we're connected to and our genetics, quite frankly, than sort of the underlying factors of where people want to sort of place blame and the kind of ideas around personal responsibility and, well, why can't you just not eat, right? Is sort of the mentality that you get in those situations. And, to me, it's just, I wanted to have a better understanding of the environments and ecosystems that we as human beings live in and how we create choices within those. And so, really, right place, right time. There was a new health policy fellowship program that Harvard had created when I was in medical school. And they wanted to take folks that were interested in healthcare and give them more of a systems level thinking, not necessarily in healthcare systems, but just in systems in general. How did they create? How do they function? Positive and negative feedback loops. And a basic understanding of teaching in economics and econometrics to sort of see whether or not you could create better informed healthcare practitioners, I think was the goal of the program. In terms of career, I was the first year they made that. Honestly, can't tell you if I'm a success or failure because I ended up not practicing clinical medicine. And so I don't necessarily know if that was, the intent of the program or not. But I'm eternally grateful for it. It's called the Jerome H. Grossman Health Policy Fellowship because it shaped the trajectory of my career in decision making ever since that point in time.
Wow. Just so like whenever you finish with the program, if you had to give it 5 stars, 10 stars, or a rating out of 10 or anything like that, what did you feel that you took away from that program?
Oh
And
yeah, yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. 10 out of 10 or 5 stars out of 5, either way. And this I probably shouldn't come as any surprise, but really what I came away with was friendships, uh, colleagues, relationships that have mattered to me ever since. And for somebody like myself, relationships really are the name of the game. And whether that be from a personal satisfaction standpoint or a professional standpoint, having those types of relationships and being in environments where you can feel like difficult conversations are possible, I think. And that's something now is, I graduated in 2016 from all this stuff. And on reflection, it's one of the things that I miss is the sort of opportunities for dialogue that existed there on any topic under the sun, where you came at from a perspective of non-judgment or, I mean, at least open-mindedness to the point where you were going to allow somebody to state their assertions, their assumptions, uh, before really trying to sort of weigh in on that and allowing people to, have that type of what I call healthy conflict that I just think is missing in today's society in general. And conflict avoidance is such a big issue nowadays. I teach entrepreneurship in business classes.
Mhm.
And one of the big things that the business world is saying to universities right now is that the people that we're having graduate cannot handle conflict. And I would just point out some social trends that really kind of fall in line with that, right? It's very much so the ghosting generation, right? You don't even necessarily tell somebody you're not interested in going on a second date. You just disappear, right? The need to or the desire to engage in any kind of situation where you're going to say something that somebody's going to disagree with, is such a huge barrier nowadays to dialogue, and so, it's just one of those reflections that I've had as I've gotten older, and the opportunities for conversations on whether that be politics or issues of the time really just feels as though that there's not really a space for that anymore. And we really, this kind of tribalism at this stage is so hyper segmented. There's not even really forums at this stage for engagement, because if you want, hard left or hard right messaging all day, 24/7, there's a million Telegram channels. There's a million WhatsApp channels, right? Where that is the only content that you are going to get served day in, day out. And there's only so much time in the day that you have for consuming media and news.
Mhm.
And when people just simply start to make these choices of, I'm going to hyper silo myself in these kinds of conversations and dialogue, it's hard for me to envision how we come back from this. I don't want to make that sound too dire, but it's something I reflect on a lot, and it's in part because I'm probably one of the last actual libertarians in America, and nobody really agrees with me on practically anything. And so in that sense, I'm always the least wanted person in the room, right? And so it's like, yeah, as a result, I'm like, I just want to have this conversation. And so I think those things, to me, maybe I'm a bit more sensitive to that, because I continuously interact with individuals that disagree with me, um, philosophically, ideologically, political economy wise, on practically everything. And yet I still stay, and I still participate, I still engage, I still stay a part of the conversation, because I think people, when it comes to these types of things, are well-meaning. When it comes to individuals, not necessarily messaging from political parties or uh, apparatchiks for political parties or things like that. And so it's just, I think, to me, it's part of the reason why I focus so much on what a lot of people call the little issues. Uh, my political leanings are purely towards the municipal level. As a true libertarian, I have issues related to, governments in general, states in general. When I think about where are the best governance structures that can exist, to me, it's ones where citizens actually have the capability of holding government accountable. And you can usually do that at the local level in a way that you just simply can't once you get beyond a certain, it's just population issues, right? In social psychology, they talk about how human beings, we can maintain networks of maybe 200, 250 people, something like that. When you get to certain levels of organization of humanity, you lose the humanity aspect of it, and it becomes so industrial. It becomes so, not because it's any person's evil schemes or some Kafkaesque system of bureaucracy, but because how do you make decisions when you have so many individuals involved in a process? And how do you try to filter that information? And then ultimately, how do you maintain trust in a system like that, that people want to continuously engage? And I think that's just where we're at in America today, right? I mean, voter turnout numbers are just absolutely abysmal. And for me, focusing on local elections, which actually happen oftentimes during non-election cycles, so say May, for example, here in Lubbock, wow, if we get 10% of voters to turn out, it is an absolute achievement. And that just hurts. It hurts because from my perspective, and this isn't a populist, I don't want to go too far into sort of the world of populism, but I just think that input matters. And I think that it matters when people don't engage, because it says something about trust in systems. And it's disappointing to me, because there's so much that we can do at a local level, whether that be here in Lubbock or any city in America, to make the quality of life better. And there's so much that we can do to make the quality of life better tomorrow. And that's what I think frustrates me is, you know, if we really were able to get the whole of a city together and talk about what it is that we want out of city government, that is, to me, the place where we all find commonality. We want safe environments. We don't want pollution. We want to be able to exercise in our neighborhood by going for a walk and there being sidewalks and not being attacked by stray dogs. We want to hear the laughter of children playing in a playground in the neighborhood. We want to know that the working mother can have a safe place for their kid to go because their elementary school is just down the block. There's so many things that when we sit down, there's a recognition of like, wow, these are just fundamental. We're getting to sort of the lower parts of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's what local government speaks to. And to me, speaks to the best. And so anytime for me, really, when national or state politics get involved at the municipal level, that's really, for me, the worst. Is just that I don't care. I don't want to, it's whatever is happening outside of this town. I personally am deeply uninterested because all that it is doing is preventing us from having the important conversations about our community that we really should be having.
Yeah.
And it's the place where we actually can take action and see meaningful change, in a short time span.
You bring up some really good insight there about how some of the national stuff is seeping into the local areas, and there used to be this saying, I'm not finding it to be true anymore, but former U.S. House Speaker Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, and I'm not finding that to be the case anymore because now
Right.
we're seeing cities and counties do more nationalistic aspects when it comes to politics and policy, which like you is I'm get very disinterested in that, and I become very frustrated with it. But you make a very good point about how this is the area that we can really do the most good, do the most everyday type of policy. And I'm curious if when you went through your program on health policy, and did that make you come back to Lubbock? Because with that sort of credentials, you could have gone anywhere, but you came back. So are
Yeah.
you happy with that life choice? And then that started your advocacy inside for city governing. Talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me first just say I love this town. It is in my blood, and there is no from a purpose. If you are a purpose-driven person, there's really nothing that can speak to you more than places that make you sentimental. And I have a story on every street corner, whether that be the first place I got into an accident, it's the 50th Street in Indiana. Actually, no, Quaker and 50th, the patch of black ice. I can't remember, it was some type of bank or something like that, had their sprinklers on during the wintertime. Where my first kiss was, right outside the Arboretum. There's so many easy ways for me to feel a connectedness to the land and the community here. And I had opportunities to work in other places, and I pursued that. After living in Boston, I moved to Singapore, and I worked for a private equity firm in healthcare. And I traveled throughout Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, spent some time in Kenya, a month there, a good amount of time in Southeast Asia, looking at opportunities for healthcare investments. And while it was very impactful work, the nature of the firm I worked for is an impact investor. So there's a philosophy behind that of profit with purpose, that you can invest in companies that are actually providing essential services, increasing the quality of life to communities. That has this sort of element of you're actually creating spillover effects to the benefit of society by making this type of investment and allowing this type of good actor within their community to be able to have access to capital and scale and grow their business. And it was deeply satisfying work to be thinking about those things. And for me, what I would say is on one level, there's just for me getting homesick and thinking about and reflecting on being exactly 12 hours different time zone wise. So 8 o'clock there is 8 p.m. there is 8 a.m. here. And just thinking, what am I doing on the opposite side of the planet, literally, to everything that I feel connected to and everything that I feel emotional towards. And so there's a tension within me when it comes to Lubbock because of the fact that I get frustrated when we fall down and I get excited about what we could be. And I believe the city can be one of the greatest in the world. I do believe that. And it's because of the infrastructure we have here, the investments that were made by our city elders years ago, and the can-do spirit and attitude that people have here, that when we make a choice to change, we make it happen. And that's the history of this town. And it's such a part of the mythology here, the 1970 tornado being a big part of that. For me, it's just the pieces are here for doing something great. And that's kind of what has me motivated, keeps me here. I came back to Lubbock, and I didn't necessarily have a plan at the time of how long I was going to stick around and what that would look like, because I don't I don't want to live my life being, a Sisyphean impersonator and trying to roll a rock up a hill that doesn't make any sense. And so I just wanted to see what Lubbock has changed and how it has evolved since I lived here and had spent some time away. It was about, what, 8 years, something like that. And I knew that the city had grown a lot, that things had changed. And so came back, happened to see in the newspaper that there was a Coffee with the Mayor event. And I thought, oh, wow, that's interesting. The mayor is engaging with the local citizens in these types of meetings. I was like, I really support that. I really like that. And so I thought I'd show up and showed up. The mayor, Dan Pope, Mayor Pope, really impressive guy. And I thought, wow, if this is the kind of politician that's in Lubbock, that has support, that's doing well, this to me makes a lot of sense. There's a lot here that we could do because again, this city has the bones for greatness. So I ended up talking with him after the Coffee with the Mayor event and mentioned my background, credentialing, and he got really curious about having a conversation with me on a topic he was dealing with at the time, which is one that's still ongoing, but homelessness in the city of Lubbock, and wanted to have a conversation about it and to pick my brain on it. And so I thought, wow, that's really cool. So he gives me his card. I reach out to his secretary, and I get scheduled in typical kind of mayoral fashion. I don't know, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later was when the meeting was going to be. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a long time. And I just thought about why I just left my previous job. I wasn't looking for anything in Lubbock at the time, and I had time on my hands. And I thought, why not take this engagement seriously? And why not do what's called a landscape analysis, a policy landscape analysis of the state of homelessness as an issue here in the Lubbock community? So I, reached out to folks, CEOs, executives of various nonprofits that are involved in it, read the reports from the city of Lubbock. There's mandated Housing and Urban Development HUD has mandated reports on these topics. Look through those. Solid best practices were out there, kind of the various elements. Drafted a memo for the mayor, and we sat down together finally after a couple weeks, and I shared all that with him, and he was really interested in it. Seemed to be really receptive on the ideas. So I stuck around, honestly, is what happened, and just kept doing kind of various projects. Fast forward to February of 2016, the Jobs Act and tax cut bill had recently passed, and there was a sort of an economic development program that got shoehorned into it. Previously had been a standalone bill, and like many things in DC, it just kind of got stuffed in at the last second. And this bill created a program called Opportunity Zones. And the mechanisms for deciding who was going to get these zones, what they were, was not necessarily a clear-cut sort of scorecard process. Instead, states would essentially nominate areas of their states where this designation would exist. And on top of that, the incentive of the program was a capital gains tax incentive. So capital gains, that's the type of tax that you pay when you've invested in something and it's increased in value and you've sold it. And that's the type of tax you pay. It's called the capital gains tax. So it's very much so a program specifically designed for investors, essentially, to create an investor incentive to deploy capital in areas in the United States that previously had been underinvested in. And for me, as you can imagine, having just worked in private equity investment, I had a pretty strong familiarity with the idea of a capital gains tax program, what the benefit of it would be, and how that could be leveraged by a financial institution. So I went to the mayor. I told him, hey, we need to get on this. He said, well, I have no idea what this is. Talk to our economic development agency. So I reached out to them. Our economic development agency just thought, this is outside of our wheelhouse. This is not our bread and butter. This is the first federal incentive program to come into existence since enterprise zones, which was like a Clinton era 90s program. And it just wasn't something that they wanted to engage or touch. And so going back to the mayor, he asked me if I would lead the creation of the proposal for the city of Lubbock to join this program. So the timing of it wasn't great. I just had a giant retinal tear. So I was, if you haven't had a retinal tear, doesn't know anybody that's had one, the recovery of those is absolutely brutal. You have to be face down, because you use gravity to maintain a bubble in your eye that keeps your retina stuck to the right position so it can heal. So I was face down for the better part of 6 weeks, I want to say, something like that. Absolutely miserable. But this is when it all just happened in timeout. So I wrote this, half blind, and got it out, recognized that we needed political stakeholders to make this work, because at the end of the day, in Austin, the decision making wasn't going to be based on a rubric. It was going to be based on, I'll just say, feels. And so we were able to get a coalition together. Representative Frullo and Senator Perry both wrote letters of support. We got on the horn with somebody in the Economic Development Office in Austin, really started bugging them about this. We were one of the few communities that was, and we ended up just doing well. So we got one of the largest contiguous allocations. It was done by zip codes. Zip codes were how you got allocated area. We had one of the largest contiguous allocations of zip codes in the Opportunity Zone program in the state. Made a lot of noise. I kind of became the toast of the city at the time. We then did one of the first grassroots Opportunity Zone summits in the nation. Mayor Pope, to his credit, had this great vision of the responsibilities of Lubbock to the surrounding community. And so he led an effort to issue a joint proclamation of cooperation with a series of surrounding counties that also had opportunity zones, that we'd find ways to promote the region together. And that created buzz. The White House heard about it, saw what we were doing out here, and as a result, Texas Tech hosted a White House Opportunity Revitalization Council meeting to discuss with the high-level federal officials, the things that we were doing here and the success that we were having with the program. And from there, I got asked to then tour some places in the South with administration officials and folks from the Milken Institute to talk about how we had thought about the Opportunity Zone program. And specifically, my bailiwick at that time was focused on how the Opportunity Zone program relates to entrepreneurship and relates to small business creation. Because there are a lot of other people that could speak to the financial elements of the program. But really here was kind of where we started the right messaging around the value of using the Opportunity Zone program to help drive the creation of new companies and the benefit that could be. And so it was an honor, honestly, to do that and to have that kind of recognition. Some of those administrators are Congress people now, things like that. It was, for me, I think the high water mark, at least in terms of my engagement with certain aspects of the city's political infrastructure. So, that goes on for a while. We're doing Opportunity Zone work, things like that. Mm-hmm. And then, really, I think the next turning point from a policy standpoint for me would have been during the summer protest movements, during the 2020.
Yeah.
Was kind of when things got, I would say, sort of took a change.
Right. And so this leads you at some point. I've heard rumor and innuendo, and this is maybe where you can set the record straight. And maybe there's a misunderstanding to where you can set the record straight. Like the idea was is that you worked um, in the mayor's office or for Mayor Pope at the time. I don't know if that's true. That was the rumor and innuendo. And then you left, and then you wrote this thing called the Disparity Report that kind of got some public attention that, quite frankly, it needed to be the attention for several years. It was like as if everybody knew what the problem was, but nobody wanted to really talk about it. But you articulated this, and you wrote a very thorough report in a very short amount of time. And so, whenever you're passionate about things, you can do that very easily with a lot of information. So, kind of walk us through what's true, what's fabricated, what's what.
Yeah, I definitely coordinated on economic policy with the city government. I was never a city employee. I was never paid by the city of Lubbock for any of the work that I did. So I do want to make that abundantly clear. When we got the largest contiguous allocation of opportunity zones in the state of Texas, I did that for free. I did that for the community that raised me. I did that for the people that raised me. And I have absolutely no qualms about that whatsoever or ever expected recompense for that. After the visibility and the work that we had done there got the White House interested, Texas Tech, the business school, then stepped in at that point to provide me with financing to continue the work that I had done in developing out effectively a practitioner playbook on how to utilize opportunity zones. And so, in terms of payment or compensation for the work that I did on economic development policy here in Lubbock, none of that actually came during that period in time. If anything, you could say that I was compensated in some way after the fact to then continue the work once it was acknowledged that the work had value. So had an affiliation at Texas Tech. Everything that I have done on the city government side has been as a citizen advocate and somebody who is just deeply, deeply passionate about the community that they live in.
Right, great. So thank you for clearing up some of those innuendos about your advocacy there. So talk a little bit about let's spend just a little bit here about the disparity report. Um, what like your background in policy lay down the groundwork as to what led you to writing that.
Yeah. I think a sense of hopelessness at that stage
Mm,
because I'd been in Lubbock long enough at that point, advocating on, to me, the things that mattered, the things that are the history we've swept under the rug, the issues that are getting in the way of greatness. Those are the things that we need, as a community, need to start tackling. And when I went through that process of economic development here, becoming the toast of the town, I really thought as though that those things would allow me to play a role in just simply creating dialogue on these topics and trying to create momentum at a policy level with the city government around addressing these issues. And what I'll say is that by the time that the disparity report got released and that I wrote it, I had reached a stage of recognition that there was no desire on the part of the local government to do any of that, to tackle these longstanding challenges, which, by the way, are the things that are holding us back from making this just an absolutely phenomenal city. And so, for me, I believed for a long time that if I showed it in data and if I showed the facts, the reality of what was happening in the city, that that would create an opportunity for that type of dialogue. And maybe it was a lack of awareness that was causing that issue. You mentioned the speed that I wrote that document. The reason was because the vast majority of it was put together from presentations that I had privately given to city council and the mayor for years at that point, and just had never gotten any type of positive reception to it. This was also unfolding as the Comprehensive Land Use Plan 2040 process was going on, which also was just an absolutely backbreaking experience from a policy standpoint because of just the absolute unwillingness of local city government to participate in any kind of property value increasing changes to the way in which that we have zoned the city of Lubbock. And then also the refusal to create an appropriate mechanism for building new roads, infrastructure like wastewater and sewage, as an aspect of this plan, which was called out by the consultants. And there was recommendations for the implementation of things called impact fees and stuff like that, which make a lot of sense. And I'm not going to, that's a policy topic I won't get into unless it's interesting. But all of these things essentially were in my mind when I was thinking about, is this something that I should, things that I've been saying privately, are these things that I should now say publicly? And at what point does it make sense to do that? The timing felt right. The folks within Lubbock were soul searching about what were the challenges for our community and what were the longstanding challenges that we haven't addressed and how we could do that better. And so it felt as though that if there was going to be a moment where I can't remember what it was, 85 page or so report on the city of Lubbock and the history of the utilization of resources here, that people would read it. And it felt like that was the right moment to do it. And so people read it. I would say that it went Lubbock viral. And from there, it created the language that was necessary for community advocates to come together and have essentially a shared understanding of the facts. And I think that to me is probably the impact of it that I'm the most proud of, was that the document spoke to a lot of people for things that they already knew, but had just never had something that they could hold on to physically to describe their intuitions. And once those things came out of the subconscious into the conscious, it was hard for many people to let that go back. And I think as a city, as a community, we have benefited from the fact that there have been so many people who have never looked back since then.
Yeah. You, I'm someone who subscribes to elections have consequences. Is this, just to kind of touch a little bit on what you reported and what you just spoke on, do you feel that this is due to the elected officials? Is there administrative who are not elected who could improve? Is the elections that we have done could improve upon this? Do you mind speaking just a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this won't come as a surprise to anybody that lives in a city Lubbock size. The central tension in a community like ours is between growth, incremental growth that is, from a city liability standpoint, bad. So growth that actually causes us to have to pay more money without getting appropriate amounts of property taxes back to try to maintain more stuff. And the tension comes between that being a central goal of a city to ensure that property taxes balance out with our liabilities and sales taxes for that matter, but that taxes balance out, right? That income coming in is able to match the cost of the things that we have. And the reality in modern, again, not unique to Lubbock, the reality for modern suburban style development is that it doesn't pay for itself. And it hasn't for many years. It costs it's actually probably larger now because of inflation and everything that's happened since the pandemic, but it's about $1 million a mile for road repair. And so when you start to add up the costs of maintenance, roads have to be repaired eventually. Stormwater has to be repaired eventually. Sewage has to be repaired eventually. And you add up the fact that routine maintenance of those things is forever, right? You never stop doing it. You can add up the costs of how much it takes to maintain these things. And the thing is, infrastructure, roads, stormwater, sewage, things like that, the cost of those things, it's not nearly as related to how many people are there. It's related to how much acreage you have to provide services to. And so when you expand like Lubbock has in a suburban style sprawl development, what we're seeing in Friendship in the Lubbock Cooper areas, that's a net negative. It's a net negative to the city's balance sheet in the long run. You can pretend for the first couple of years it's a net positive because you've added new houses to the property tax base. And if you ram your head in the sand and pretend that maintenance of infrastructure doesn't exist, then yeah, that's the end of the story. But new places become old and old places get older. And if they get neglected, the cost of maintenance of those areas gets higher and higher as you fall farther and farther behind in maintaining them. And that's where we are as a city here in Lubbock. It's where a lot of communities are right now that have had suburban sprawl. It's partly why some metro areas, I'm thinking of Minneapolis, Memphis is another, have actually de-annexed suburban areas of their communities because they just simply can't afford to maintain them. They just simply are not paying their fair share of the cost that it takes to maintain a community. And so why is there a tension in that issue? It's because generally the most politically influential and powerful individuals in a community like Lubbock are the people who profit from that development because it is some of the most lucrative and largest types of purchases that anybody's going to make. So if the average price of a home is $300,000 and you as a developer can get 10% to 20% margin on the sale of that property, we're talking incredible sums in a very rapid time scale, right? And all of that subsidized by the federal government through the stability of the loan and home mortgage market, things like that, right? You can nationalize these topics, in terms of why does suburbia continue the way that it does.
Right.
But, fundamentally, those individuals that profit from this process of suburban sprawl have an incredibly strong vested interest in creating city policies, not just simply advocating for city policies, but being involved in their active creation of city policies and then the maintenance of those city policies over time to allow for that sprawl to continue. Now, the tragic reality of that sprawl here in Lubbock is that it really matches nicely with both a wealth flight from the city of Lubbock as well as a white flight phenomena that is still ongoing. So the previous board of LISD trustees oftentimes would say that people don't understand that LISD is now minority majority school district. And it's not because of that is reflective of this general population. It's because infrastructure investments that were done part and parcel with developers enabled the creation of the Friendship School District that we think of today and the Cooper School District that we think of today. There's a really interesting analysis that I like to reference that was done, published in Science in 2022, that's called the Social Capital Atlas. And it's an analysis of Facebook accounts in a really rigorous way that tries to track where somebody went to high school and what was the likelihood of that individual having a rich friend, right? So somebody who's in sort of a higher income strata than they are.
Yeah.
And there's no clearer picture than this than in Lubbock. Estacado High School ranks in the 99th percentile, right? So the absolute worst in the nation, right? So if you go to Estacado High School, the likelihood, right? If you went to Estacado High School at any point in time, right? These are people who have put they went to Estacado High School on Facebook. For those individuals, they have the lowest probability of having a single individual friend that is considered to be high income.
Wow.
And then compare that to Friendship and Cooper, which are actually above national averages in terms of those numbers, right? So if you go to Cooper, the likelihood that you are going to have rich friends when you leave Cooper is actually higher than the average for high schools across the United States, significantly so. And that is a phenomena that only has existed in the last maybe 15 years or so, which directly coincides with the infrastructure build out of Milwaukee and the Marcia Sharp Freeway. So city policy enabling white flight, there is a long history of that in Lubbock that goes back to desegregation. And it's unfortunate that we just simply continue this process of, robbing Peter to pay Paul, essentially. Because the community that actually is paying for all of this stuff, right? They're paying for the white flight, they're paying for the wealth flight, they're paying for their school district to collapse. Most recently, Dupree, one of the oldest, most historic elementary schools in Lubbock, in the heart of Lubbock neighborhood, was closed down by the school district a couple of years ago. They're seeing waves of school closures, and simultaneously, Cooper and Friendship are in the fastest growing school districts in the state of Texas for years now. Cooper has gigantic, there's a second high school they're building. They're like a 6A, right? Super school. Um, how these things have changed in my lifetime is startling. And for me to see those types of things, it's hard not to question what we're doing to ourselves, because all of that shiny stuff will be old one day. And when it's old, do we just keep expanding? And if so, do we just keep expanding until we reach a breaking point? And it certainly seems like we're getting near one, when the city council recently decided that whenever you have to repair a sewer line, that's now actually the private citizen's dime that has to pay for that. So you're now, what it used to be, if it was on your property, you were the one who paid for it. Now, if you have to pay all the way up till it goes to the city's main line. The city requires you to have a specialized certified plumber to touch that part because it's their property. To have the plumber with that certification and for them to get a quote for that, they, do a maybe 30, 40, 50% upcharge to what it would typically cost for that additional burden, right? And the city says that it would save them about $800,000, which for the city's budget is like absolute peanuts. And what a pain point to pass on to citizens. And also, I think just pointing out the policy disconnect there. So when it comes to building a new neighborhood for a developer, right, a guy who's never going to live there, the city will essentially pay for almost all of that infrastructure. Impact fees, I mentioned that earlier. Simplistically, they allow you to have developers pay a certain percentage of the cost of building all this stuff. Again, this stuff that will never actually generate enough money to pay for itself. But what you can do is you can at least have them pay for some of the cost to build it. Nothing to say about the maintenance. The maintenance is forever, and there's nothing you can do about that. But you can at least have them chip in. In Texas, you can have a developer chip in 50% of the cost of roads, 50% of the cost of stormwater, 50% of the cost of wastewater, right? So essentially, you can do a half share with them. In Lubbock, developers pay 25 cents on the dollar for roads, and they pay nothing for wastewater and stormwater, right? So it's totally fine when the infrastructure is built to give it to developers for free, people who will never live there. But once it comes down to the people that actually do live there, all of a sudden the city can't afford it. We can't afford the maintenance of this infrastructure. It's too expensive. It has to be the private citizen that has to do it. And it's just, I can point out a lot of these sort of disconnects between city policies, the differences between how one group is treated or another. Most people just call that crony capitalism, but it's just sort of the nature of the game. And when you have a political power structure that's sole purpose from a municipal level is to essentially continue to allow for suburban sprawl, that their vested interests are in that. And I've had people in this conversation tell me, how dare you make these suggestions? I built this town. you know
Yeah,
And
yeah, I think I
you know,
know the people you might be talking about. So,
and it bums me out. It bums me out because when any of those individuals actually speak with me human to human and they feel the passion that I have for this town, they're just, I've gotten apologies. People have apologized to me, and they won't tell me what they apologized for, which I think is interesting. But I'll take it. I'll take it. But
well,
it is
you bring
interesting.
up some some wonderful points there, and that is, I mean, that sort of policy stance led to an activism that I don't know if you started, but you got active into. What was it? Is it Lubbock Compact? Is that correct?
Yeah, so that was an outgrowth of the people that came together around the disparity report document and the interest that there was in trying to make sure that accountability at the city level would continue. So I created the organization, the original bank accounts, everything like that. But I deliberately was never on the board. And I was a policy advisor for the individuals that were on the board and for the people that did operate the organization. And that was my role in it. And seeing the initial creation, walking through that process, recruiting individuals in the community who I thought would be great advocates and people that it would make sense to engage in this topic in. And then after that point, just simply providing insights, best practices, recommendations to those individuals about how to be an effective advocacy organization. So a lot of coaching, I think, in that way, as a result. And I'll just say I'm enormously proud of where those individuals have gone, what they've achieved, and the energy that they bring to these conversations here in the city of Lubbock. I think at this stage, if you tried to tally the level of influence of the organization on city policy, it would be in the millions of dollars. I would say that they could easily take credit for the significant increasing of allocations for paving dirt streets in Lubbock, which has been a really embarrassing and neglected topic. The vast majority of dirt streets in Lubbock are in the northern and eastern parts of the city. These are not new neighborhoods. The other thing that I'll point out is that from a zoning and codes standpoint, there's not supposed to be residential neighborhoods in Lubbock that have dirt streets. So when you're talking about some of the oldest neighborhoods still with dirt streets, and this, by the way, is we're talking about a legacy of an area that received electricity, I want to say 8 years after everyone else, some similar timeline in terms of running water. There's it's embarrassing and it's sad that we continue to replicate and perpetuate these kind of decisions that were made back in the day, which nobody today is saying that any of this was racially motivated now, but it was absolutely racially motivated then. And there's not
Yeah,
even
you're exactly right. It was. There's no question about it.
there's not a
But
shadow of a doubt, in 1923, when the city of Lubbock passed its ordinance segregating the city, it made the very bold claim that Black individuals need to be separated because they pollute the Earth's atmosphere, right? They pollute the earth and the air, right? That their presence as human beings is pollution. And you see that as well in the decision making around industrial zoning in the city, right? So, you know, 23 setting the standard of saying industrial activity and Black people are the equivalent. They are one and one and the same. And so you can co-locate those because that way things that pollute the earth and the atmosphere are just matched up together. And it's just hard, I think, to look at that history and then see decision making on a city planning standpoint, right? So every 10, 20 years, the city would come out with a new land use plan document about how it's going to develop the city of Lubbock. And when you walk through that history of plans and you see this kind of lockstep growth of industrial zoning along the growth of minority communities here, it's just hard not to look at that and think, this doesn't feel good.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, this
yeah.
doesn't, right? This feels like things that we probably as a community need to address. Because yes, nobody is saying anybody is racist today, but if we continue to perpetuate things that were clearly racist when they were created, and the people doing it were not like they were not hiding this in any way, shape, or form because they didn't need to be. The longtime news editor for the Avalanche Journal, Mr. Dow, uh, that guy was just a card-carrying racist. He was a super big fan of the KKK.
Mm.
Uh, and you can read that history throughout like AJ articles and editorials for decades. Like that's just what the city was about. And, we can either acknowledge that and recognize that that's the part that kills me, is that the challenges that we face as a community in Lubbock, they are within our means to deal with. Like if Dallas, example here, if Dallas said, we're going to deal with the history of racially motivated industrial zoning, and we're going to get rid of every EPA toxic release site, every lead smelter, every crematorium that's in a neighborhood. That would be billions upon billions of dollars, right? That is a federal super fund would have to be involved in such an enormous endeavor. In Lubbock, we are talking about, I want to say it's 11 EPA registered toxic release sites, maybe 3 crematoriums, and a really unfortunate string of concrete batch plants along Clovis Highway. That's it. And here's the thing, in property taxes, when you look at the tangible assets, right? So property taxes are separated between the value of land versus the value of stuff that's there. When you look at those numbers, industrially zoned areas of the city of Lubbock represent less than 1% of the property value in the city, right? They represent an incredibly tiny fraction of the city's coffers, of the property taxes that are generated. But this is what's wild about it to me. If you tomorrow got rid of all of the industrial sites in the city of Lubbock, from the city standpoint, you wouldn't even notice really from a balance sheet standpoint. And practically most of the city wouldn't notice either. But for the people that this impacts on a daily basis, it would be profound. It would be absolutely profound. Whether it be the well-documented asthma exacerbations that occur in those neighborhoods more than anywhere else in the city, whether it be the cleaning off of weird chemical films on people's windshields during cottonseed processing time. Like, there's just so many places and so many ways in which the quality of life, if you just want to experience it in a simple way, wait for a really windy day and go eat at Montelongo's, amazing Mexican restaurant, Clovis Highway. And if the wind is blowing north to south, you're gonna eat dust, and it's not dirt, it's concrete dust. You're gonna eat pulverized, fine-grained dust that gets everywhere. And people that live in that neighborhood talk about how much of that comes into their homes, gets through the seals on their windows, into their cars, right? Like kids breathe this in as they play. It's just, what are we doing? And that's the thing, is when we're talking about what would it take to do something about this issue, it's within our means. If we wanted to create an industrial park where we would co-locate all these polluting entities, we could afford it. It really would pay for itself in the end, because these areas, and this is in data as well, there are analyses that are done, and these have been done for decades, but they've become more sophisticated. They're called value per acre analyses. And what they do is they try to standardize what is the value of that property on a per acre basis, if that makes sense. So it tries to make it so that you can compare the value, property tax value of a home with, say, a Walmart, as an example, by saying we're going to standardize them on a per acre basis. And what does that look like? And what you find in this analysis was done some years ago, a gift by Park Hill Smith and Cooper to the city of Lubbock. What you find is that areas that are industrially zoned have terrible value per acre. Not only that, but when you create heat maps of the city of Lubbock, you see that those industrial areas create huge property tax value dead zones, right? So it's not only do they, as individual properties, create very little property tax value to the community, but they actually suppress property tax value in the larger areas that they surround,
Mhm.
right? They create, and that makes sense. Do you want your McDonald's to be next to a concrete batch plant, right? Or a crematorium for that matter? Right? You don't, or a lead smelter, right? And so, that should be intuitive. There should be an intuition there in terms of that being the case. But it's still something that you have to point out. And for me, as somebody who, again, I come at these things from what is the role of city government? As a libertarian, it's really two things. It's to essentially provide essential services to create a quality of life here, and it's to preserve property tax value. That really, to me, is the other thing that cities are supposed to be doing. Because if the city effectively preserves property tax value, right, then that means for the same amount of land that we have, if the value of all that land is higher because there's better things that are there, not industrial stuff, there's more money to pay for all the things that we need. And so for me, being able to say value per acre matters, being able to say from a property tax standpoint, that's another issue that I have with those industrial sites, is that they are suppressing areas of town where property taxes we could be generating so much more if instead of an abandoned field or a dumping ground for furniture and abandoned cars, which, by the way, those areas are actually next adjacent to some of the nicest parks that we have in the city of Lubbock. If those areas were shopping districts, as an example, and oh, surprise, you probably didn't know this, those areas, a lot of them were actually zoned as shopping districts pre-desegregation. And so you can look at the 1948, the 1940 land use plan in Lubbock has areas for commercial shopping all throughout North and East Lubbock. Fast forward, Brown v. Board of Education, Jim Bertram's amazing 1973 land use plan. Now, with the desegregated city, the white flight phenomena now takes off, which, by the way, happens before the tornado. Right? That's something that I think is also really misunderstood about Lubbock history. White flight and the abandonment of that area of town was happening before the tornado did.
Yeah.
The tornado accelerated the process, and Jim Bertram speaks to that in his land use plan by mentioning the fact that once the tornado went through, it was clear that the area had become a place that was not desirable because white families decided to not rebuild their properties there. A lot of those people had already left because their children had got zoned into the Estacado School District, and it was supposed to be a mixed race school that was going to be held up to the Department of Education, Department of Justice, as showing that Lubbock had desegregated. And it was an enormously failed experiment. It was the first white flight phenomenon in Lubbock's history. The Cherry Point Parkway neighborhood was originally a pretty nice, when I say nice, I mean from a property value standpoint. It was a middle class, like nicer homes neighborhood specifically built for white working class citizens here in Lubbock. And in the land use plan, when they were living there, it has plans for how to continue to expand that development, areas where new roads would be built, areas where new infrastructure would be built, areas where new economic activity and commercial shopping would be built. And then, weirdly, the next land use plan that came out, all of that was gone.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's just sort of like, and that's why Lubbock is a case study for these issues. To me, is so valuable because it's just so clear. It's just so clear here because there was never a need in the city's history to hide any of this. And as a result of that, you can go back in city documentation and find this paper trail like a signal beacon. This is not difficult stuff to find. All of this is at the Southwest Collection, by the way, if anybody's interested in pulling the land use plans. The 1973 land use plan, weirdly, was actually not included in the city's new updated comprehensive land use plan. They had references and links to every other one of them except for that one. But that one is at the Southwest Collection, and you can download that and read it yourself.
That's great. Yeah. So you got some really good information there, and I'm very grateful for you to bring that out. And I think your passion for Lubbock was even brought to another level when you got a weekly spot on the Lubbock NPR affiliate
Hmm.
for your show called Around Town. And so that was on for 2 seasons. You're planning a third.
Yeah.
Before we get into any of those things, I want to ask you, do you like were you given like like weekly ratings of your show or any of those things? Like do you know what was the most listened to or
Yeah.
like did you get any sort of calls from people saying, hey, you need to be a bit more political on this issue or you need to really, hammer this person or like did you get any sort of, well, for lack of a better word, advice
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that?
fair, fair. So uh, in terms of the show, in the radio world, you get ratings twice a year. And then on the online streaming component, you can see engagement, impressions, and streams, things like that. And what I will say, and I'm proud of our show, and I'm also proud of everyone else who was doing shows as part of the local Friday block. So Fridays, the idea behind that was we would have a series of shows that would lead into each other. They were all locally produced. And I'll just say that our engagement was like, I mean, there was no comparison in engagement between our period and anything else in terms of whenever uh, the station, other programming on different days. Friday was absolutely the high watermark across the board. Around Town specifically, my show was rated as the number one non-syndicated local show in the city of Lubbock. And so, we had good following, we had good engagement. In terms of, questions and getting asked about, the sort of the approach to the show, it's funny, because honestly, no one ever really critiqued it from a perspective of saying we weren't hard hitting enough, because that wasn't really the intention of the show, and that the show is more of a manifestation of who I naturally am, which is a cheerleader and an advocate for the people that live here. I am not combative by nature. I very much so want to resolve conflicts through dialogue and finding a middle path and finding a middle ground. And so for me, the show was an opportunity to just simply express my love for the community without any of those things sort of coming into the equation of it. We got a lot of positive feedback. The stuff that to me was the most endearing were folks that would say that they set their Friday morning calendar to us, how much they look forward to waking up to the show. One guy sent a message of saying that like, oh, it was his oatmeal, his daily, his morning. He loved having his morning oatmeal and listening to the conversations that we were going to, to the conversation and who we were going to have that day as a guest. Um, and it's like, that's what kills. That's the
Yeah.
stuff that gets me, because that's somebody telling you that they have made a change in their life to appreciate the things that you were doing and the contributions that you were making.
Yeah.
And that I think is just deeply satisfying. And partly why what's happened to the station subsequently has just been such a gut-wrenching experience is because I think from a production standpoint, all of us that were involved in this process thought that we were absolutely crushing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it wasn't too long after you were planning for a third season
Yeah.
and you're notified. Wasn't just you, all the other locally produced programs were notified that they would be dropped from the lineup, and one particular person who's been there for about 30 years has to retire by the end of this month. You made a public Facebook post that really captured how stunned you felt. Do you mind, um, if you don't, I can just move on to the next question here. But to walk us through what that was like, hearing something that you thoroughly enjoyed doing. There's no question about that. it was no longer going to be broadcast. Like what was, I guess, for lack of a better question here, for lack of a better wording, walk us through what your process was whenever you hear all this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, stages of grief, I think are probably a good description here overall. Yeah. It first I didn't believe it because it just seemed so out of the blue.
Yeah.
And it felt that way for my producer, right? So other thing I should say here, I was not paid for creating the number one non-syndicated show in Lubbock. I was a
Right, that's right. Yeah,
volunteer.
yeah. Let me also say that to the listeners. The hosts volunteered. The ones who were paid were actually the producers, and they were let go. And this is just kind of the domino effect. Yeah.
Correct, yeah. So again, this is something I do as a labor of love, is as a way to give back to this community and to celebrate the community that I love. And so first it was disbelief. I didn't think that that was something that would happen, and my producer didn't think that was something that would happen, which made the whole process even worse. Whenever these folks were let go, they were told that the plan for doing this had been long coming for months. And so for the staff, for the producers, it was confusing because, it felt as though for them that they had been misled, producing shows that would never get aired, doing reports that would never be seen. And it was just like, why are we just doing, like, what was the purpose of all of this? Like, to just sort of the maintenance of appearances. So in that sense, Chuck Luck, my producer, and I had just met. We had started to block out. We were going to stretch in terms of the types of programming we were going to do this time. And our goal for the season was that we were going to have a whole month-long series on the 1970s nightlife of Lubbock, which I'm obsessed with. Chuck is also obsessed with, because it's such a special, unique, just absolutely countercultural period in Lubbock that is just forgotten, especially when it comes to the music scene here. And people oftentimes think, how did all those great artists come from the city of Lubbock? And it's like, this is why. Like, there was this element here, this amazing energy and nexus of places like the what's called Fat Dogs, Stubbs is pretty famous, places like that, where because of the fact that Lubbock did not allow for alcohol sales except in clubs, that's the change that occurred that made all this happen. They just became the gathering places for everyone. Everyone turned up for these places, and it was just a different city. The people, when they were at these places, how they interacted with each other, it's a whole, like, it's just a different world than what people are familiar with in terms of the Lubbock story. So we had gotten in touch with some of the previous owners and people that knew them, and we're, gosh, it was, anyway, that was one of the things that we planned on doing in the season. So we had worked all this out. We had started reaching out to people, gotten commitments of when they were going to come in, all that stuff. And that's when it happened. And I just thought, no, like, we have to do this. Like,
Yeah.
this is gonna be made. Like, yeah, like, oh geez. And then reaching out to folks, and just hearing about the way that things had happened. The hosts are the public facing part of these shows. And so I started getting a lot of messages from people just because of that fact. And people just sharing with me either insights about the issue or their own personal struggles with it, and what was going on there. And it just made me really sad, I think, in terms of how all this has played out, when it comes to the way that these folks got treated, and the decision making around why this radio station, why so many people needed to get removed, when a typical producer on the radio side was pulling, I want to say it's maybe 40K, so 40K, 50K maybe for producers. The hosts are free. I don't really know how you get locally produced shows that have a lower price point than that,
Yeah.
in terms of what was being put out there. And I mean, the other reality of it too, which is now starting to get revealed by the AJ article and things that are circulating through Texas Tech faculty in the faculty senate here at Tech. It's just concerning because when you look at the success or failure of, say, the radio station, these decisions actually have really nothing to do with the radio station at all, but more to do with the cost that this university incurs in maintaining super expensive TV stations. And that's the part that's a challenge. The TV stations are the element that's actually the place where that's just a money pit. You're essentially setting money on fire because there's no underwriting really for that, and the production costs are very, very high. Especially on say compare apples to apples on a per hour basis between the two. And really, quite frankly, the reason why all this went down has nothing to do with even Lubbock, actually, but has to do with a commitment that Texas Tech Public Media took on a couple years ago to maintain PBS El Paso, right? So the PBS affiliate in El Paso.
Mm.
Now, you would think, oh, wow, that's a big market. Maybe they can get some money, sort of things like that. The name will confuse you. The largest provider of PBS in the El Paso market is PBS Las Cruces, which is run by New Mexico State University. And so PBS El Paso, run by Texas Tech, it's not like, first place, second place. It's like first place, and then we're a distant second, right? So vast majority of people in El Paso, one, don't even know that Texas Tech PBS exists or that they operated. And when I say the people in El Paso, I'm specifically talking about PBS listeners in El Paso don't even know that this exists there. But hey, it's $1 million+ a year that essentially gets set on fire to maintain these things. And so I think that to me is the part of the story that's really sad, is that it had really nothing to do with the radio station, everything to do with the TV side of things, which I'll just simply say is a different business. NPR radio stations outside of university affiliates, I don't know how many of them operate television stations as well. And if they do, they're completely different businesses. They're completely different operations, completely different organizations, essentially. Station manager wouldn't run both, as an example,
Yeah.
because they're just different businesses, right? And so at Tech, with Texas Tech Public Media, the challenge there is that all of these things are blended into one giant account, one giant operating account, which wasn't always the case. Until the Texas Tech Public Media rebrand, the radio station was a separate entity called KOHM. And that entity, and this is where the Cheryl Skybell letter and the AJ article, sort of play a role in this. But from Cheryl's perspective, the radio station never had a finance issue in terms of its ability to pull underwriting and grants dollars to pay for itself. And in fact, she makes claims in her letter that every year the operating accounts of the radio station were cleaned out and used for other purposes, right? So if you were a donor to Texas Tech, if you were a donor to KOHM Radio, your dollars were not going to supporting the radio station. They were just going to whatever else made sense at the time to whoever was the boss of all of this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So to hear, I think that for me is another part of this that really hurts, is to know that the Lubbock community, to the tune of around $400,000, that's what Cheryl says, was giving generously to the radio station. And Cheryl worked there for 19 years. And she says that essentially the whole 19 years that she was there, that's the average rate that they pulled in. It's sad to me to think that this community has been donating and attempting to have a world-class public radio station here for the better part of my lifetime. And yet there was nothing to show for that. There's actually a negative, I can't remember what the audit said in terms of the Texas Tech Public Media's total net negative expense. There's nothing.
It was fairly large, yeah.
There's no endowment, there's no resourcing whatsoever. All of this stuff is hanging on by an absolute thread, despite the fact that people in Lubbock have wanted this and have continued to give to something like this, for decades.
Mm.
And that's what hurts, is to know the fact that if that's true, wow, it really is sad. And here's the thing, I don't think it's illegal. I don't think what they did was illegal, uh, in terms of, having this organization shift financing around. I think the sad part of it, though, is I doubt a lot of the donor community giving to the radio station, believing that this was for radio. I doubt that a lot of them knew that, no, that whenever they were giving, it really could have been used for anything. And despite the fact that they were being engaged through the radio station to donate, despite the fact that it was the radio station's branding that was there, despite right, all of that, essentially that the fact that their donations would be used for radio was implied, essentially, in the way in which that these things were done. Um, and so that to me is, I think, the other part. I feel sad for the state of television in general in America. I feel sad for the state of PBS television stations because, quite frankly, they can really only exist in gigantic media markets at this stage just because of their overwhelming costs. I feel sad about those things. I don't understand why that has anything to do or should have anything to do with whether or not there's a great public radio station here.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and so, yeah.
and just to give a little bit of context, the article that Dr. Bergfeld's talking about here is that Alex Driggers from the Lubbock Avalanche Journal did a little bit of investigative reporting in a Sunday piece that can easily be found. There's no paywall to it. You can go to the Lubbock AJ's website and you can find this, where he obtains a letter from a now retired faculty about these particular instances, about some perhaps misuse of funds, and there was a faculty senate meeting called, and that led to the AJ asking questions, and the tech brass, the administrators at Texas Tech, answered them. I mean, we don't really have to like or dislike those answers, but they answered them, and they were all published. And so there is a little bit of a tip of the hat to Alex Driggers for doing that story. It's much needed. It garnered a lot of attention. It needed to. I was very pleasantly surprised that such a story was done, because it seems like those types of things are what some media types in our area don't really want to touch. But it needed to be told, and there's another element to the story here that I was kind of, someone like mentioned it to me. I didn't quite understand it until that Lubbock AJ story came out, about how there's one particular radio station manager who I'm I don't have his permission to mention his name. Everyone can look it up, but he wants to get what's called Lubbock Public Media. And that leads into my next question for you, and my final question here is that you mentioned about how you possibly want to get the title around town, like you want the copyright for that and the trademark for that, hey, that's awesome. But it's curious because there's other media out there for you to really bring that out, like Substack, YouTube. There's actually a site called Medium. There's Blogspot, Beehive, all of these particular outlets for you, so that you can publish your podcast or your recording and interviews. Is that an avenue you're willing to go down and to possibly do to continue your program?
No, quite frankly.
Okay.
People in Lubbock listen to radio. If I was in a different market, if I was in a different place, it'd be a different conversation. You have to meet people where they're at, and you have to communicate with them through the medium that they prefer. And people here listen to radio. And to me, wanting to engage in this, wanting to do something as a volunteer to celebrate the city of Lubbock and its people here, my interest in that is to promote that and to know that it has reach and engagement. And I'm not going to spend my time attempting to create a podcast following and try to build that out over time for something that I do for free. This is not a career so much so as it's more of the fact that I allow for parts of my life to be acts of service, and the value that I would get personally in creating a show that was not on radio is pretty minimal. And so it's just not worth my time. The other thing too is that the only person I really want to do this with is my producer, Chuck Locke, who's a local radio legend. And again, his time is not worth it for doing a podcast either. It's just not for who we engage, why we engage, the stories that we're telling. Neither of us are thinking about this from the perspective of creating a media outlet and attempting to promote it on our own. This is something that made sense on radio, that killed it from an engagement standpoint on radio. So if we're going to do it, it's going to be on radio. And so, yeah, Lubbock Public Media, that was mentioned in the article. That's just a red herring. It has absolutely nothing to do with any of the conversation. The dude who's leading it sees an opportunity for being able to get donor dollars from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting by putting classic music on air, which, by the way, classics, right, cheapest stuff you can play on air. And so his goal there would be to effectively have a staff of two, which is the bare minimum for every region. The size of your radio region determines the FCC requirements for technicians, what you need on hand, sort of things like that. You have to have two people technically for this region. And so it would be a two-people outfit that broadcasts classic music 24/7, and he would be getting grant dollars for providing that service, and it would be a nonprofit. I could care less. It really has nothing to do with public media, has nothing to do with NPR, has nothing to do with access to NPR programming. It's just one guy who's a longtime radio guy seeing an angle in the market and seeing an opportunity there.
Well, I tell you what, just to kind of put a bow on all this, was there anything that I missed? Was there anything that you wanted to discuss? Just to mention here in the next 3-4 minutes that you felt that just to kind of tie it all in, to tie up everything here on a really just your time on coming back to Lubbock and your activism in Lubbock, your advocacy. What else can people, where can people find you? Where, what, just kind of, what else needs to be said?
Yeah. I'm always open to collaborations, for the folk, for the Lubbock listener, for the individual that here's the things that I'm working on and it resonates with. I want to connect. And the easiest ways of doing that are Facebook, which similarly, a lot of people in Lubbock still use Facebook. And so most of my public posting is on there. Or if you want to connect professionally, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. I'm also quite active on that social media site as well. And to me, it's if you believe that this city can be great, I want to talk to you and recognize that I want to win. People who grew up here have chips on their shoulder. We tell Aggie jokes for a reason. We don't anymore because they're in the SEC now. But we've always felt as though that we're the hinterlands when it comes to the rest of the state, and that just creates a certain mentality, both a can-do attitude as well as a "will just watch me" then type perspective. And if you feel that too, if you're that type of person, that gamer who wants to win, wants to see things do better, wants to be involved in excellence, wants to see this community achieve the greatness that it can, you know, I want to know. I want to hear about your ideas. I want to connect. It would be the last thing that I would say.
All right. Well, Dr. Nick Bergfeld, thank you so much for joining my podcast here today. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights, and sir, I wish you all the best in your future endeavor, and I know you're cheering on Lubbock throughout the way. So we appreciate your advocacy in all avenues of this city. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time, and thanks for what you do.
Hey, Drew, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things and unpack a couple of the challenging issues that we face as a community here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again.
Take care.
All right. And that is today's interview. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy all the content that you get from The Outsider. Please share and subscribe. Please share and subscribe. Share and subscribe. I hope you get the point here and the drift. The Outsider and its podcast. Free and paid subscribers. You get 3 months of paid content if you share The Outsider with your friends. And if 5 of those with whom you shared subscribe to the free content, that's a steal, folks. What a tremendous deal that is. You go to the Outsider's website at drewlandry.substack.com and you subscribe today. Thank you for listening in, and I look forward to giving you more content, more good content in the upcoming days. Thank you very much.